Hello, TC112-3. I hope you guys are having a very happy Tuesday. Today I have the honor of welcoming Courtney Roberts to our class. Hello.
Thanks. Hi.
I want to say hi to the class.
Hi, everyone.
If you guys want to go ahead and let us know that you can see and hear us all right in the chat, that would be great. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and do a roll call of who's online with us today. Right now we have Alicia, Alice, Anja, Caroline, Christina, Donica, David, Jean, Jessica, Jennifer Leopold, John, Julie, Matt, Haskell, Paulin, and Rajneesh. So again, if you did not hear your name listed, but you're actually there, make sure to send me a message so that I can check that out with the tech team. But that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Do you want to do a brief introduction about yourself and what Moonshot Global is to the course today?
Absolutely. So I'm really happy to be back at Tech for KM, a course I've actually guest lectured at before. I love tech change courses. I encourage everyone to take more. I've also guest lectured at the M&E course too. I'm Courtney Roberts. I'm founder of Moonshot Global. We're a boutique ICT for D consulting firm. We focus on digital development. We also do knowledge management and learning, impact measurement, and we have a business acceleration and investment advisory practice also. We're actually, right now, we're engaged in doing a diagnostic on an ICT for G company that's gotten an investment, some impact investments. It's very exciting. So I'm happy to answer questions about the presentation or offline if you have other presentations about the work that Moonshot Global does. I'm happy also to answer that. Just a tiny bit about my personal background and why the firm is what it is. I spent most of my career at the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, and we worked mostly there with governments. And actually, I founded Moonshot when I left to work with a wider group of people in the global development space. So we've worked with governments a lot, which sometimes is rare in the global development space. You meet more people who've worked with constituents on the ground or with other organizations that donors are actually hiring people to help. But we also have worked with those implementing partners in developing countries, but also with governments and also with community-based organizations and civil society on the ground, and in addition also to individual beneficiaries or constituents of foreign aid. So kind of run the whole gamut. So just wanted to mention that. So my perspective is really broad. So
that's great.
So anyway, I guess I dive right in, right? So
yeah, so if you guys want to make sure as we're starting the presentation that you can see the presentation slides, remember that you can always chat me if you're having any issue throughout. That being said, let's go ahead and switch over to the presentation slides.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So, are they up?
Are they up? Sorry, let me just do one thing real quick. Look, is this full screen? Do you mind if I switch screens back up? Aha. Technical difficulties at Tech Change. What is new? So let's just go ahead and get in that screen share then very quickly. And we should be able to switch right back over if you want to start from there.
Perfect. Okay, well, without further delay, this is technology for knowledge management. And before we start, I know that the course has just started and there's many experts in knowledge management already, but I want to make sure that if we have tech experts or if we have people who are still just learning, get my take on knowledge really means. And when I talk about this, I like to steal a colleague's slide, Nancy Dixon from Common Knowledge Associates. She's a KM guru. She's had 40 years of experience in KM, and I work with her from time to time. Clients, we just finished a project at the World Bank together. This is her slide, and it talks about the evolution of knowledge management. And I like to talk about the role of technology within each of these three sort of phases of knowledge management. So at the beginning, when people started talking about knowledge management, it was really all about collecting content and managing content and controlling content and making it available to people. The so-called explicit knowledge, that information that's already written down and captured somewhere, but might not be accessible to people. In this era, it really led with the tech. KM was actually synonymous with a system, a tech. They thought that once you built the system, that was it, you were done, that was knowledge management, which we all know is not the case, but that's really how it began in the 90s. And then in 2000s, people started focusing more on connections because they realized that if you built it and you put the things on it, people didn't necessarily come. And even fewer people actually used the information there. So it was really more about people and connecting people together and leveraging that what was in people's heads and wasn't only written down. So this experiential knowledge, or it's sometimes called tacit knowledge, was important to both identify and then leverage and then include in some of the repositories and other forms of exchange through processes. And so the second phase, we focused a lot on communities of practice, on internal expertise locators in big firms. Management consulting firms were famous for being good KM firms. And also processes to make sure that teams were learning before, during, and after their activities, and not in a kind of, you all heard, recreating the wheel. But people understood that even not that was enough. Okay, explicit knowledge, tacit knowledge, fine. What about this? The whole point is once you're connecting and creating and accessing information is to create a new take on something, to actually build knowledge together collectively. And a lot of that focuses on conversation, not on processes, like getting people together and going through sets of questions, but actually back to the basics of just interacting with individuals to get the perspective, to get the context. And this is the most valuable aspect, in my view, of KM for development, because context matters a lot. And creating collective knowledge together with the person you're actually supposed to be working with to serve, but also to gather what they know, to feed that back into design. Moonshot Global actually focuses a lot on taking learnings and feeding it back into design. But this last era is where everybody aspires to be and very few people actually are, and is this leveraging collective knowledge. But that's where the user controls content. It's very user-centric, transparency, and a lot of acting and learning in public rather than kind of hoarding knowledge or identifying the expert to guide you through the place, like empowering everybody. So that's a long slide. Took a long time on it, but it's important because it really sets the stage for where does tech fit in and what does this actually mean to you?
Right, which is ultimately the question we're asking in this course. So
exactly. And regarding questions, if you have questions along the way, I invite you to ask. Though I'm going to have to pop over on the other computer.
I'll read them for you.
To
Don't
see
worry.
if they're there. But you know, I just described this, but this is a graphic that depicts a KM system. And we're going to talk about these eras of KM, but we're going to also talk about it in the context of the system, which I guess isn't quite up on your screen yet. But
theirs is a little bit delayed.
It's coming. It's coming soon. Yeah. So by the time I'm done describing it, you'll see it. And the KM systems integrate 3 different things, and all wrapped around by one thing, and then managed by another force. And I'm going to describe all those. The technology, which we talked about in the first era, the processes, which we talked about in the second era, the people, which is sort of the center of the third era. And what are they doing? They're working together in the context of an organizational culture that sort of encompasses them. And then the focus is to sort of manage and make accessible and influence knowledge flow and use and knowledge creation, ultimately. This little circle Venn diagram also needs governance structure on top of it. So that's not something that's seen because we don't have a third dimension. But on the third dimension, you would pull up governance, like who's accountable for what, what's the kind of managing the whole thing, and how does it actually proceed. I don't want to be too far ahead of the slides, so I'm not sure where we are. The next slide talks about types of technological tools. So if it's not up yet, I'll just frame what it's going to look like, but it actually should be up while I get into the description. I'm going to take the people part and the processes part, and I'm going to show you the types of technological tools that connect the two. Because unlike how the first era of KM kind of put technology at the center, my view is very strong, and that technology is really the easy part, and technology is what connects the people and the processes. The technology can be very low tech, or it can be very high tech. It really matters more what you have in terms of budget and capabilities of those people to implement the technology. But what you see now are types of technological tools in terms of their features and functionality. So when you're deciding on a tech tool, you need to understand the features and functionality that you're after, and then from there, select the different individual tools that match those needed features and functionality. So again, the tech is the tool that connects the people to the processes. It's not so important what the actual tech is, it's more important what the functionality is, and you let your budget and your skills of your people using the tech dictate what those are. So if you just look at this, I won't insult your intelligence by reading the slide, but if you look at some of the things that tech is supposed to do, it's supposed to facilitate communication, collaboration, applying knowledge, distributing knowledge, tracking, personalizing, codifying it. When you talk about the actual things that you can put inside each of these bubbles, it's really extremely varied. Knowledge codification can be people who actually sit there with an Excel spreadsheet. That's a type of tech. Or it can be machine learning that is applied and has more of a smart way of doing it. Well, obviously, those two choices need vastly different skills, capabilities, and resources. So it's really unimportant what the particular tool is. It's more important, like I said, what the skills and resources are at the organization. So how do you actually incorporate all these different types of tools into a KM system that includes people, processes, technology in the context of culture, managed by governance to impact knowledge flow and use? Well, what I like to do is, I've mentioned already, it's important to look at individual competencies, but for KM, one thing you can do is name KM competencies across an organization. And for organizations that have a hard time understanding what KM is, it's a really helpful framework to use to help them understand all the different component parts of KM. It's not the only framework, but it's one I like a lot. And it actually isn't mine. It's another ripoff. I like to do that. You should do it too. If you find something you like, you should actually credit it with a little footnote, and you should use it. And the source for this is Chris Collison and Jeff Parcell. They're two other KM gurus, both of whom I've met and co-delivered conferences with. But they wrote something called Learning to Fly, a book in the first era of KM that actually covered more than just technology.
And I think people are going to be seeing this screen right now. So if you want to just explain, like if anything looks a little bit different to you, for example, the KM strategy and the measurement should also both be connected to this bottom.
That's strange. I don't know what happened
arrow,
with that. It didn't happen the last time. I don't know.
But if you want to use this computer just for right now to read off of, and I can actually check out what's going on in that one while you're going.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It changed my font for my slides and everything. So I don't know if it's got what's going on. But there's 7 different competencies in the KM competency framework. KM strategy, leadership support, networking, learning before, during, and after, capturing and applying knowledge, innovation, and measurement. So the KM strategy is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a physical document, but it definitely has to have a grounding in a kind of an assessment of what the organization can do. And in order to get that assessment, you would want to figure out where the people are and where the existing processes and technologies are. So you need to apply tools like network analysis and ICT-enabled survey instruments in that phase to actually get the information that you need. And I mean, when I talk about ICT-enabled survey, it's anything from SurveyMonkey to Google Forms to Magpie or Comcare or some of the other mobile data collection services that are there. Network analysis, also you can do that using tech tools. You can also do it sort of through observation and recording in a very low tech way. Leadership support, that comes really down to management support and championing for knowledge management in the context of the organization. So you can have a great KM strategy with lots of good processes and people. And if your CEO thinks that it's not important, it doesn't give you time that you need to do it, it becomes like an extra thing, knowledge management in everybody's job, it's never going to work. So one of the ways to reinforce leadership support is to make training available for people, to make it part of the onboarding process that KM is something that you do, and to make it possible for people to access these things and keep track of them wherever they are. And some examples of that are online toolkits for whatever knowledge management that's being shared in the organization, and also a learning management system so people can sort of track their progress and how they're doing against certain competencies that the organization thinks are good. You might think of other tools too. These aren't an exhaustive list for each of these phases, but they're just applications of tech in each one of the competency framework elements. For networking, you can think of this, there's sort of two proxy things when you think of networking, because networking happens internally within an organization and externally with partners and constituents. And internally, obviously, to network, you need emails, shared calendars, and intranet, social collaboration tools that are, too really numerous to name, but you can use project management software that enables you to share works in progress. Some people use Slack when they are doing joint work. Some people use photo sharing systems. Even some people do all their collaboration through Facebook on it just depends on the organization. But it's ways for people within the organization to communicate and find out from whom they can get help. A process that you often use is called a peer assist, where you can know what people know, and then you can leverage them to do your jobs better. That's a way to internally network for learning. Externally, the most common form is a community of practice platform. Those are becoming more and more outmoded. And people often want to create a community of practice. That you can't actually do that. Communities of practice exist, and they're just given tech and content curation to support them to thrive. So that's important to remember. You can go super low tech and just do Google Groups or other kinds of group listservs. So, anyway, it's just a way for people from outside the organization to connect with people inside the organization. Learning before, during, and after. There's ways to incorporate tech. You can take crowdsourcing check on something beforehand. If, say, you're doing a training course, you can do an online survey, or you can put something out there, getting people to respond to an idea. So you design the course really well. You can, during the project, you can also leverage project management software again. Afterwards, you can have databases of repositories of information and wikis. Some of the processes that you put in place in the learning before, during, after phase, like an after action review, you may use tech to record, actually physically record the session through a recording tool, so that people who weren't there can listen later. You might do a video of it so that you can share it with people who haven't met you before. It's always nice to see a visual. Then capturing and applying knowledge, that's where taxonomies come in, tools to help you create taxonomies, whether they're straight sort of Excel sheets or machine learning. Content management systems for your websites and your intranets. Again, mobile-enabled surveys. A lot of these you see repeated, but I'm just trying to explain contextually how these tools can be applied differently in the different phases of the competency framework for an organization of knowledge management in general. And then in innovation, this is brainstorming tools, visualization tools like Tableau and others can be used to support processes of innovation, which is necessary for organizational learning. And then measurement. The last phase of organizational KM competency is monitoring and evaluation, and that's of the KM itself. So this is not different from M&E for the organization, but when you have KM, even if it's not a program area that's separate, your measurement system needs to be infused with targets for those knowledge management activities.
Yeah, and I think as we go, if you can just continue to talk about the overlap and how these two different fields kind of intersect. I think that's a question that's come up a lot in the forums for us. So if there's any insight that you have to share as we continue, that'd be great.
Okay. So in the measurement, the tech tools that you can apply are databases, contact management system, website analytics. And the reason for that is measurement of KM should actually measure things like usage of the website, how people are learning from training, and you would capture information like that in these IT tools that I reference here. So you actually are supposed to, when you do a knowledge management assessment, one of the things you can do, it's a really good way to do it, is apply the different competency components to the organization, have the people meet in groups and define, like, what do we already do in each one of these areas of competency for the organization? And then how will we apply tech to do each of these things better? Because tech, like in most places, is actually an enabling force in knowledge management. That's the main link. It's one of the circles on the KM system that we saw a couple slides back, but it's an enabling force. You can do KM without any tech at all. You can't do KM without process with people. But if you're not using tech, you're really having a lot of missed opportunities because it's so efficient and it's so effective, and it saves a lot of money and time, and makes your work much more inclusive. You have the possibility to reach more people, and the possibility to represent more people's perspectives. If you just find a tool for every one of these competency framework components, then rank how your organization is doing in there in terms of both the use of technology and in performance along the competency, you're going to have a more robust view of what's really going on. So I actually paused just for a second because this is a really meaty slide too. And I wanted to see if you had any questions before we moved on.
Yeah, and while people are generating those questions, thinking of what they might have to ask about this organizational KM competency framework slide, I think one question that came up earlier from Jessica when we were on the governance overlapping the people, process, tech is she had said, I find setting up governance tricky. There are a lot of stakeholders at our organization, M&E, research, program quality, IT. So do you have any tips on actually setting up that governance?
Okay, so governance is linked to the leadership behaviors component. In my opinion, it needs to be of the competency framework. Governance has to be both championing from above and being there in the ground up in the form of having KM be everybody's business. I like to say it in that way. In every organization I go to, I say, there's a wide variety of views. Most times you get to organizations that are like, oh yeah, we have a KM person, we do KM. And I'm like, oh, okay. No, that doesn't mean you do KM. That means one person does KM. Let's see if the organization really does KM.
Right.
Now, if you only have one KM person, it doesn't mean that the organization doesn't do KM. It could be that they do it very well. It means that one person is accountable. So you have to make people accountable. And the best way to do that is have recognition from the top down. In other words, CEO is saying, yes, this is happening, and here's how it's happening, and here's our strategy, top down. And then from the bottom up, who's responsible for what, and what are their targets in terms of delivering. It can be centralized in a KM person, but that's inadequate for organizational KM. That person can make everybody else accountable for certain targets and be responsible for pushing it. But if KM is not everybody's business, the organization is not doing it well. So the reality is KM needs to be everybody's business. It needs to be included in the induction process, written into job descriptions in terms of what aspect of KM is every job function responsible for, from the project assistant to the CEO. And then to make sure that you've got leadership support for that. And if you don't, I don't really have any good tips for how to do it, except for in a guerrilla way, right? If you are the KM person and you need to get other people's support, one thing that I've done in a lot of organizations in developing countries is create what's called a KM core team and leverage monitoring and evaluation in IT, because those are the two areas that there's a lot of overlap. And every single project on the planet has M&E because the donors require it. So I say that they're kind of entry points to KM, and also entry points to M&E, but they're the same. But KM, one way to enter it is through the tech, and another way to enter it is through the measurement. And that's why it's so important that they both exist in your KM framework, both the tech and the measurement, because if you don't have those, you can't make that case.
Right.
So I hope that helps. It's a little convoluted answer, but
yeah, there are actually just a couple more quick questions. One question, I think you might have covered this already a little bit. Christina is asking, how do you incentivize that buy-in? And then Anja is also asking, do you have examples of KM targets?
So incentivizing buy-in depends on the organizational culture, I believe, a lot. You can teach a whole course on incentives in KM. So I won't be able to do the answer justice, but I will say this. You have to take your guidance from the culture. And I'm talking about not only organizational culture, but culture, like people's culture. So when you have a decentralized organization that's got geographic diversity, you have to keep that in mind. How will things actually work in different offices based on national cultures or just office culture if it's in the same nation? And so you have to actually ask the people what incentivizes them. And then organizationally, it's a little easier to test. You can do that through surveys, and you can look at norms, and you can establish what norm you want to have, and figure out what you do have, and identify the gaps and design an incentive to specifically speak to that gap. And I can give you an example from a Rwandan organization I worked with. In Rwanda, nothing gets done unless it's in something called an imihigo, and that's a performance contract that everybody has. Doesn't matter what type of organization you work in, you have an imihigo, unless maybe it's a pure private sector organization. And the imihigo states out what you need to achieve in order to get like your raise or keep your job, and people take them very seriously. They've really been instituted from the top down, from the president down,
Right.
in the country. So when I worked with the Rwandan organization and they had one single KM person and KM wasn't in everybody's imihigo, I said, look, I can't do my job unless KM's in everybody's imihigo. So everyone got a little worried because they said, wow, we can't add something on. And I'm like, well, it's not adding it on. It's just defining what is it that's related to KM. Does this job type do? And there was an example of a gap in presentation skills. It was an organization that was managing capacity building for the whole country, figuring out where money went for training and capacity building, money that came in from donors, and it was sort of dividing it out to the ministries that needed it most. And they had to go around the group, had to go around and present, what it is they did to everybody that they came in contact with. And some people were horrible presenters and some people were good ones. So there was a huge gap, and what they wanted was a presentations training course, which we gave. And then the KM core team that was engaged to help on the activity decided they wanted a Toastmasters club. And Toastmasters, for those of you who've never heard of it, is like where you go and practice public speaking. So the incentive to make sure that people were engaged in doing presentations well and using the new templates that we set up that were branded and all these things that were based on PowerPoint template, which is the form of the tech being involved, okay? And then shared on an intranet, which had never existed before, which is another example of the tech being involved. The incentive to like practice your presentation skills was this kind of competition-based participation in Toastmasters, which was really fun. It was a fun activity, and it was all competitive, and you could give a lot of feedback, and people really liked it. So it was much more exciting than being told you had to practice giving your presentations.
Right.
It became a fun thing you did on Fridays, and an incentive for people to improve on their presentations.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of like such a personalized incentive.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think that a Toastmasters Club would relate to KM, but it did in that context, and that's important. So any more questions before we move on?
I think if any more questions come up, I can go ahead and read them to you as they come.
Okay, good. Well, I think I don't have a whole lot more slides because I know we only have, well, when I leave time for questions.
Yeah.
But we just went through a bunch of examples of different types of technological tools, and you may feel a little sad that I didn't give you more and more lists. But really, I want to emphasize how important it is to lead with the function and the feature of the tech and not the tech. The tech is really the least important part, because all you have to do is figure out the function and the feature that you want, and then go search, because the tech tools change all the time, for whatever tech tools are available at that moment in time. And then you have to ask yourself, how much money do you have to pay for them, and how can we implement them? Do we want a subcontractor to implement them and then constantly like pay them to give us access to them? Do we want to build them in-house and use them? So those much more important questions when you're selecting technological tools after you've defined the features and the functionality that you need is to use some kind of a framework to prioritize among the different features and functionalities that you need. Because everybody wants like the Rolls Royce, right? And most of us can really afford, a Tata car or a Honda. Maybe some organizations can afford a Honda, but very few people, if we defined everything we wanted, it would always be the ultimate. But what I like to say is, once you kind of establish that you have your KM system, that you're actually implementing an approach in all the competency areas, that your individual people can actually come to the table with skills, then you focus on what tech tools to apply, and you ask yourself the question, what must we have? What should we have? What could we have, and what we won't have this time because of whatever reason, either no money or no will or no tool that exists or no capabilities in-house. And this is called the Moscow framework. Okay, so it's a pretty old thing that's been around since the 60s or maybe even before. Another ripoff, but it's from engineering. And it's a prioritization technique that you use to rank each dimension that you think you might want according to a high, medium, and low timeline and resource constraint framework. So you literally just write down all the features and all the functionality, and then you ask yourself, what do we have to have that it won't actually work without? And some of the things that you would absolutely have to have, for example, would be an externally facing website. And something that you would have to have there would be, security that would protect you against hacks and other things. You can't do knowledge management and learning without, putting out there your knowledge products that you're going to produce and make available to your audiences. So that's a must-have. I would say a shared network drive is another must-have. I actually worked with another organization in a developing country that had 70 people in an IT department of 4, and they didn't have a shared network drive. And that was just dangerous because all of their individual computers housed the intellectual capital of the organization. And this was not a low resource organization. This was not a low capability organization. I'm not exactly sure how it evolved, but they didn't have a shared network drive. But this was an example of where someone probably took too seriously the adage that you can do KM without tech, right? But because they definitely needed a shared network drive just for backups. Right. There's no way to have a functioning organ and version control. So anyway, those are the must-have categories, the kind of easy, obvious things. The should-have they're important, but they're not vital. You think that you might like them, but maybe you really don't have the resources to do it, or maybe you're actually working in a remote area where even if you had it, like people wouldn't be able to use it very well. That's probably in development the most common thing that falls into the should-have category is something you really need, but like given your environment, it's going to be really tough. And that might be, for example, online collaboration for works in progress, for example. That's ideal, to have a project management software or to use the Google Suite to share documents live, so you can actually have multiple people in at the same time, or to communicate via Slack. But the reality is you might have to rely on something like WhatsApp instead, which has a lot fewer features because you don't have the bandwidth to use Google Docs. Right. It doesn't actually help you if you're in an office where you don't have almost constant internet connectivity to use Google Docs. It's actually hard. You're much better off kind of emailing versions back and forth because it takes a lot less time to use the internet. But, with the proliferation of mobile phones, people are increasingly using messaging apps to replace some of the things that are more sophisticated to make sure they have that collaboration. It's a little frustrating because there's not a lot of features and functionality, but it's probably the thinnest client ever, and it works for me anywhere I go. Right? So you absolutely should have some way to have collaboration, and you might have to forego a ideal solution, and that might be painful, but there'll be the solutions out there that you can use that are less adequate but can work in your environment. Right. And then the could have are really the things that there might not be organizational will for, like, maybe the CEO supports KM, but isn't going to support it with dollars, but with labor, so you can't actually build that great integrated intranet and extranet and that has kind of a database of your trainees that everyone can search and is linked up to your M&E framework as well that you can search. I mean, you might not have all of those things, but you can still have the functions and the features in less sophisticated tools, like the Excel spreadsheets that gather all the things, and then the outputs that you would then post up on your website in kind of a PDF or an HTML file. So tech is supposed to be your servant in the context of KM, and you really just want to figure out what works in your resource and timeline context. So, and then there's a whole host of things that we know we'd like to have and we can't afford, or it's just the field is just too early to have widespread. And examples of those are things like machine learning to help with taxonomy development, and other widespread availability of the whole suite of software tools that you might want, like InDesign and a full version of Adobe and all this sort of licensed software that really helps you do knowledge management, learning, collaboration, and co-creation better, but are just too expensive. So I don't know if I need to pause, but just to make sure there's no questions.
Yeah, maybe we'll take a question from Paulin right now. So Paulin is asking, how did you overcome political issues between different departments whenever you were implementing KM projects? Sometimes it's frustrating that, for example, establishing a web page or a website subsection, providing access, etc. is so complicated. And I think she went on to say that there are sometimes competing values within the organization. On the one hand, they're told to collaborate, but then in reality, they're actually competing with each other, so knowledge sharing ends up biting you.
Yeah, it's true. That's a very complex question. And I can give you two examples that sort of illustrate two cases, but by no means is there sort of a one size fits all answer. You're going to hear that a lot, which is frustrating, but we're dealing with people. We're dealing with people. And when we're dealing with people, we have to have a lot of different ways to answer the question. So in terms of I have actually personally experienced creating a web page, not only a page, but a website. In the context of the World Bank Group, I will give you the specific example because it's long done. In the investment climate division, we were in a multi-donor agency, which meant all the different parts of the World Bank were supporting it. And our job was to actually make an externally facing website that handled a topic that 32 other departments touched in some way. And none of those departments were the people in our department. So we were in a multi-donor department where we had all the different agencies at the bank group working. So MEGA, IBRD, IFC, all the people working together. And we were experts in investment climate. And then we touched all these other groups within those 3 different groups that had some slice of investment climate, like say they did transportation issues or say they did competitiveness issues and all of that. Since then, the bank is completely reorganized and they're all harmoniously working together, or at least that's the idea. But what I had to do was physically go around to 32 parts in the organization with a mocked up web page design that would show what the investment climate team site would look like. And the investment climate team site was supposed to capture everything everybody was doing across these 32 organizations or divisions within the organizations. The reality was we knew that the capabilities were all over the place. We knew that our division was actually going to be the thought leader in the space and would take control over the narrative of the content. And we had leadership recognition that we needed to do that. But it still didn't matter. All these department heads didn't care about the leadership recognition. They cared about their own knowledge. Right. What we did was 2 things in the process. And it took a long time. It took me like 3 months to do these 32 meetings and build a consensus of a sort. First of all, the prototype was super simple so that people could add to it. And we actually took their opinions into consideration and did add to it. Now, we didn't add to the homepage. We added to the second layer. What we did was we evolved a second layer that kind of represented what everybody did. The other thing that we did is we created sort of a positive competition. Yes, there were knowledge hoarding to the extent that many of these 32 organizations didn't even have an externally facing site at all. They were so knowledge hoarding that they just had intranets. But I tell you, once they saw that we were putting things externally, they wanted to be a part of it because they didn't want to not be a part of it. And there was this kind of overall management support. So we did 2 things really. We created a healthy kind of competition for sharing. And then we created a space that there was this perception that they had something to do with creating. I absolutely recommend creating a mechanism called a knowledge management core team. And I mentioned it before, and I've referenced the M&E department and you should include communications too, but you should do communications, M&E, IT, and not anybody with any knowledge management expertise. But it should also have at least 1 representative from each department or division or group within the organization. And it shouldn't be always the project assistant. It should be somebody who's got some weight. It can be different levels of people from the different parts of the organization. Somebody who really wants to understand what KM is, wants to be like the voice of knowledge management for their group. And you get that group functioning. We did that in the case of the same Rwandan organization. And I've done that in every area where I've ever worked. I've said, I need a KM core team. Sometimes it's 3 people, KM, M&E, and IT. And sometimes I actually convince them to give me somebody from each organization. And what we do is everything we teach to this core group. And then on the second intervention, I actually have those people be the trainers of their groups. So we teach them a couple of different processes in knowledge management, and then they're supposed to be the champion of that within their group. So each group gets kind of the identity of being the owner of that particular process. So one process can be as simple as like a brown bag lunch, no tech at all for that. So you assign that to like a really not a tech savvy group, right? And another one could be like owner of the expertise database and peer assist mechanism, which you might make through a completely sophisticated use of video technology, backed up by a web page that has all the data on everybody who knows what. And the more sophisticated group can be that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are just different ways you can combat the problem of knowledge hoarding and lack of participation of some of make participation mandatory.
Yeah. So I hope those examples answered your question. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And if that generated questions for anyone else, we're looking for your questions too. Do you want to continue on your slides?
Yeah. So this is I think this is coming to the end, if I remember my presentation properly. Where does M&E meet KM? Because I added this, I think, in the last Tech Change class. There was a desire to connect up the two. Oh, no, I didn't answer the question about measurement. So this will answer the question about measurement, because I think the second part of the question before was, can you give some examples of some measures for knowledge management? So I'll address that here. I didn't forget. I just temporarily blacked out. So I'll answer the measurement question, but first of all, I want to talk about how M&E and KM work together and what function tech has in all of this. So first of all, I'm a real advocate of newer monitoring and evaluation. So what the old-fashioned focus would be on in terms of knowledge management would just be counting people who show up to certain things or counting people who use certain things, right? And it was really a focus on explicit information, quantitative measures, and things that you could just see, and not things that you could use qualitative indicators to delve into. And so I'm an advocate more of M&E in the new era, which is on the right, that starts out the column data focused. So instead of just taking information about explicit knowledge, actually focusing on what's underneath that and what kind of experiential knowledge that you have that you can share. And not only what you observe in terms of numbers of people, but when you focus on macro issues in monitoring and evaluation, to find out like what have actually people learned and how they applied what they've learned and then reincorporated the back end to the design of the system itself, then you can really measure what the intermediate effects that knowledge management has. And what I mean by that is, if somebody uses a website, that's interesting to measure it. It's a very objective measure in monitoring and evaluation. The guy or the girl showed up, right? But when you talk about learning, what you want to know is, what did they do when they were on the website? And what did they draw from the website, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to know, how much time did they spend? You can get some of that from quantitative indicators in your web analytics, for example. You can say how much time. So instead of reporting how many users you have of your website as a KM indicator for some tech connected thing that you're measuring, you would look at the quantitative indicator of how much time did each person spend when they came to the website. Much more interesting than the users. If you have 6 users and they're spending 7 hours each, that's much more interesting than having 100 users that actually jump off after one page. Right. So when you're talking about learning, you're talking about a lot of subjective things that require surveys to get at. Now, the example I gave you of the website use, let's just continue with that. It's not only important to do the quantitative measure of how much time, which is a rather formal way to measure use, right? It's quantitative, it's formal, it's verifiable, right? This is moving over to the right-hand column on that objective, subjective, meticulous, formal. But what you really want to know is, what did they actually read when they were there? And what did they think about what they read when they were there? And that's much more messy and much more informal, and absolutely 100% requires a conversation. And that's where knowledge management and learning come in. To get at what you're actually learning from knowledge management, you have to talk to the people and you have to do follow-up. You can't only rely on quantitative indicators. So if your organization is just tracking what they call outputs, now you can tell I'm a bit of an M&E wonk, because I could say outputs, outcomes, impacts, know the difference among them. But we don't care how many people are on the website. We care a lot more how much time they spend, and we care even more what they actually do when they're spending the time, because that's really going to get at what's the effect that your website is having on people. Okay, so that's one example. In this comparison chart, you can sort of build out each kind of idea of where does M&E link KM, on every horizontal for every, and see how you can think of things traditionally and more formally, or then you can think about them less traditionally. And when you use technology, it winds up becoming less traditional, right? Because it adds sort of multiple dimensions to it, and it improves things like access and inclusivity, and things can happen in real time. They can happen in geographically dispersed situations. So it becomes a lot more in the column of the non-traditional M&E.
So just if I'm getting this right, the M&E and the KM columns that are both on the left-hand side, those are the traditional models, and then the ones that are on the right are the like non-traditional models of what we're evolving into.
Exactly.
KM? Okay.
And where we want to be when we think of KM is on the far right. But what is important to remember is everything you do on the far right, people and relationship focused, messy, informal, focusing on really small issues that matter to individual people that are involved in the work that you're doing, and focusing on connecting explicit and experiential or tacit knowledge. In order to do that, you have to actually take stock of that periodically. And you have to connect it back to a way that you can record that information, because you can't get at relationships unless you actually track them. I mean, it's all going to be anecdotal and sort of not. I mean, you can't say the value of your storytelling workshop that you've had in knowledge management if you don't actually focus on the information that was still conveyed in that. You can't just say, "Hey, I finished a storytelling workshop. I'm done. I did KM." No, I want to know what you learned and what's the data that came out of it. It has to be focused on tracking in a non-traditional way, because you're kind of in this non-traditional space of like creating new knowledge, which is the far right part of KM. But you still have to be rigorous about it and connect up your learnings through to your M&E system. So this is a slide that doesn't really relate to tech. This is more heavy KM slide. But this is, again, the way in for KM on a lot of organizations is through the M&E budget that you have. Your M&E people will love you if you actually come to them with data. Your M&E people will love you if you can connect up to the big picture results framework that the organization has, and give some kind of stories around the things that they need to tell to relate the results of the project. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the reason I mention this is I view knowledge management and learning and tech that's sort of enabled by technology as part of a system that goes way beyond the knowledge management system. The tech that you have should not only be connected to the KM, but should be part of the M&E too. So again, if you're new in an organization and they create this KM function, and you already have M&E and you already have an M&E system and you already have all these other M&E tools, you don't need like separate KM tools. You just leverage what's there for monitoring and evaluation. And you say that you're part of this overall integrated monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach. Mm-hmm. And this is my own, so this is the one thing in the presentation that's mine. This is where I see KM fitting into the overall monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework. And it's really at the center. Knowledge generation, reflection, and use is the basis of what the organization does. And you capture it in a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework. It connects up to program design. It relies on and informs constituent feedback. It's necessary to figure out what type of capacity development people need in the areas where you're working. It actually should, everything that you're doing in terms of knowledge generation, reflection, and use should be captured in a database and managed. And then the indicators that you are tracking across your project should actually include knowledge generation, reflection, and use aspects to them, dimensions to them. So I've talked a lot by example already, so there's not really time to go through another case study. I don't know if people want me to anyway, or if you want to actually reserve the last 5 minutes for questions. I'll give you your own choice here.
Okay, so there's like a 30-second delay before they hear us. So while that's happening, I'm just going to read a couple questions that have come in the meantime. So one of them was if you could speak more to the ways to actually measure that KM impact. And I guess that goes into those indicators and different things that you were talking about on the last slide.
Okay, I can do that. So there's 3 ways to measure KM. Well, you have to have output-oriented indicators, you have to have outcome-oriented indicators, and those two together relate to impact. KM is an intermediate thing. You can't get anything from KM. You can record the number of people who go to your website. We've already said that's relatively uninteresting. You can say how much time they spend, also uninteresting, sort of. You can say what they're actually doing by asking them in a survey, whether they've learned anything from what they've read, where it gets most interesting. So those sorts of indicators, those kind of output and outcome indicators, the last one being outcome, like have you learned anything from that? Those are pretty standard and common and in use in a lot of places. So you ask someone, did they use the particular thing? Did they find it useful? Did they learn anything? Okay. That doesn't measure impact at all. What measures impact is asking them, well, what did you do with the information that you learned? Did you apply it to your work? Okay. So that's where you find out about the impact of the knowledge management. Now, you're not necessarily talking about global development impact yet. You're just talking about learning impact. So did that person learn? Yes. Did that person then apply it? Yes. Well, that's impact. They learned something and then they applied it. That's an impact. The KM tool, the KM activity had an impact on that person and that person's work. Okay. To ask yourself, does it have any development outcome connected to the impact of in the learning, or any development impact connected to the impact that one gets in the learning? You have to actually ask, well, did that particular thing that was learned and applied positively affect the outcome of the actual intervention? Okay, so that's really, really complex and very often not measured and very hard to measure, and takes a lot of resources to measure, because not only do you have to understand and survey, well, what did you use the thing, how did you use it, did you learn something? You have to have kind of a baseline, and then you have to have an end line of data to see, well, what was happening before that learning occurred and what was happening after that learning occurred. And then to be really super scientific, it would have to be a randomized control trial that would say, well, what about in another environment where that wasn't learned? Maybe all that change just happened because the global economy crashed, and it didn't have anything to do with the particular learning at all. So then you run into traditional challenges in M&E in general. So I would definitely stick at first to making sure that you're trying to capture learning impact. Like, does the learning that the person said that they got? Everybody always says, did you find the website useful and was it good? Well, that actually doesn't really matter either. If they like it, but they couldn't use it and apply it to their work, it's not really that important. So It's super important when people say they have applied the things that they've learned. And then if you have the resources, you can start to measure, is what they applied actually changing the nature of the project in a positive way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense for sure. Another question that had come in was from Jessica, and maybe this is going to be covered in this case study.
Well, I don't think I have time because I only have till 3.
So she basically just wants to know if you have any example strategy that reflects this integration that you were talking about on the previous slide. So
do I have an example? Is there like an organization that does? Overseas Development Institute is really good about doing all their work in this way. I don't know if that's what you mean by example. Like, is that what you mean by example? What organization actually applies this?
In the chat box, let us know if that's what you're talking about, an organization that applies this.
Yeah.
And another question that had come in right before that was if you had any tips on pitching. I know before we were talking about that KM core team with the communications and the IT. Do you have any tips on how to pitch that to an organization? This is coming from Jessica, who actually was the person who said, I'm that one person that you're talking about.
Oh, really?
Earlier,
okay, interesting. Well, I think if you're that one person, what I would recommend is, first of all, it might not be M&E IT. If you're a real person working in a real organization, in that job on your own, I would actually look for friendlies, actually informally take your colleagues to coffee and find out who's interested. Because the core team doesn't need to be people with those other skills. It's just usually there's a lot of overlap among communications, KM, M&E, and IT people in terms of the skills that are needed to do the job. But if somebody's interested in KM type activities, you should just seize that and find out informally over coffee who understands what you're talking about, who's like that person who always takes part in your activities and is kind of a facilitator, and get informal agreement outside, and then go together with someone else. If you're there, you're probably not like at the same level as a CEO, it would be ideal to get some kind of sponsorship from a manager too. It doesn't have to be your manager either. It could be a manager of an organization that needs knowledge products, for example. I found that knowledge products are kind of like this big carrot. Even if people don't understand anything about people or processes, they don't care about strategy or leadership behavior, they often want that toolkit, or they often want like the lessons learned documented, right? So appeal to their kind of vanity also and say, hey, let's produce this thing because you're a thought leader and I'll help you and I just need your support. So that's another way to appeal. So those are the two things. Find informal partners first and then go together with them, and then make sure you get some kind of a leadership support, maybe not even from your own. You have to at least have acquiescence from your own manager, but get the support from some manager.
Okay, that being said, I think that we're wrapping up on that 3 o'clock time period. I know a couple of people are still asking questions. Maybe we can follow up on them in the future with that. That being said, I think we're going to wrap up and maybe talk about that KM strategy document more in the future.
Oh, a document? Well, you have to hire me to get an actual document. This is the bread and butter of what we do. Most of the organizations that I work with, the KM strategies are not public. Because, or I would actually share them. I was sort of joking, but this is really what Moonshot Global is hired to do, is to get in and produce these. And that usually the organizations that we work with in developing countries don't necessarily publish those, and some do. I mean, I could point you to some good strategy documents that I know of that are public. They, to a certain extent, are integrating KM and M&E. Some do it better than others. IFAD has a really good KM strategy. That's a good example. IFAD, if you know them. I can follow up and send some of the ones that I know of that I actually use that are public. I've also seen some good 4-page KM strategies that I use. I actually require every organization I work with to lend people to the strategy development process. So even if I'm personally responsible for writing it, I have to have people on their side who are contributing. So I usually use this typical outline and a typical 4-page strategy to show how simple it can really be. But you need objectives. You need, it's nice to connect up the KM objectives and KM. Usually people have a mission statement. Sometimes they have values. So I like to get people to write KM values that echo the organizational values. Everything that you do should be totally tied into the organizational strategy and then linked to the M&E and the comms strategies and the IT, if there's usually never an IT strategy, but it has to include elements of IT throughout it as well. So it doesn't have to be a long, complicated thing. IFAD's document is long, complicated, but very good. It can really be simple. It just has to be integrated into the whole.
Yeah, so that being said, I think in the archive write-up, I'll provide a couple links to the public documents that you're talking about. Thank you so much for joining us, Courtney. I know that we're rounding up on time. I hope that everybody enjoyed this session. There are 2 more sessions this week on Thursday and Friday. Check the calendar for those. Looking forward to seeing you guys online later.
Bye. Thank you.